It's 1849, and Muhammad Ali Pasha, the man who ruled Egypt for more than 30 years, has just passed away. His rule saw Egypt enter into the most successful program of modernization in the Islamic world. From 1805 to 1847, Egypt had turned into a cotton exporter, giving it stable finances. Its industrial policy allowed it to establish a domestic textile and weapons industry. Egypt developed a modern army and navy, which Ali used to great effect, expanding his rule to Sudan, Syria, and parts of Anatolia. Yet by the end of his life, Egypt was stagnating. In the Second Egyptian-Ottoman War, Ali had nearly gained victory and was very close to achieving independence from Ottoman control. But due to European intervention on the side of the Ottomans, he had to accept unfavorable terms. Not only did he have to cede land, but he was also forced to shrink the size of his army and navy, giving the Ottomans significant control. In 1838, the Ottomans also agreed to the Treaty of Balta-Liman. This treaty opened Ottoman markets to British goods, and since British goods were more competitive and Ottoman domestic policies for industries were already bad, the local Ottoman industry collapsed and the empire became dependent on British imports. The only thing they could export were primary commodities which were low value. The problem for Egypt was that since it was part of the Ottoman Empire, it also had to abolish its tariffs and monopolies which were necessary at that point until its industries became more productive. This early opening meant that British manufactured goods easily outcompeted local industry, causing many factories to close up. In such a delicate position, Egypt needed strong leadership to keep pushing it towards the path of reform. But the 1840s instead saw Ali showing signs of becoming more senile and Egypt losing focus. By 1847, things had gotten so bad that Ismail had to step up and take over, but he died shortly into his rule. Despite this setback, Egypt still had candidates, and the person that did take over had been well prepared for the role. Ali's grandson, Abbas, had experience governing one of Egypt's provinces, had fought in the war against the Ottomans, and was seen as a natural successor to Ali. He took over in 1848 and would rule for about 6 years, but in those 6 years, he tried to reverse most of the reforms that Ali had implemented. Under Abbas, what trade monopolies remained were abolished, schools were shut, the program of sending Egyptians to Europe ended, investments in the irrigation system and improving Egypt's agriculture, one of the few things it had an advantage in, saw a reduction. Abbas was fairly reclusive and limited his contact with outsiders, which not the best sign of a good ruler. He was also fairly hostile to Europeans and tried to reduce their influence. An example of this was Abbas removing French advisors from the bureaucracy, which, if you want to remove them when you have people who can replace their skills, then fine. But they're probably there because you need them for now. If that wasn't bad, he also opposed the construction of the Suez Canal. Another policy shift from Abbas was moving Egypt closer to the British at the expense of the French, which again, this is not to say that everything was bad under him. For example, his relationship with the British did result in the building of a railway between Cairo and Alexandria. He did a good job governing Egypt, with its finances remaining stable, and Egypt was largely crisis-free during his rule. However, this did not reverse Egypt's stagnation. If anything, he made it tougher to get out of. Also, remember, anytime Egypt stagnates, it is effectively declining compared to Europe, which wasn't gonna go back and give it a helping hand. Overall, Abbas's 6 years as ruler saw Egypt wasting crucial years, losing momentum. Egypt's industrialization had failed and it was now relegated to a commodity exporter. His aversion to Europeans and ending the trading programs meant Egypt lost people with valuable skills with nobody to replace them. His reign would have been a complete failure had it not been for one reputation-saving policy, his horse breeding program. He spent a lot of time on this and also spent a decent amount of money on this passion. You might say he is wasting time, but have you looked at these horses? If Abbas loved horses, he didn't extend the love to his servants, and it seems like him mistreating them caused his demise. 2 of his slaves killed him in 1854. He was succeeded by his uncle, who was actually younger than him, Said Pasha. If Abbas was what Egypt didn't need at the time, Said was exactly what it did, someone who believed in modernization in a careful and proper way. Said reformed tax collection and increased property rights for peasants, making them more independent. He encouraged the building of infrastructure and kept a more balanced relationship with the French and the British. Probably his best policy was supporting the construction of the Suez Canal despite opposition from the Ottomans and British. Some of his policies required Egypt to take on debt, but it was manageable. Egypt's best years under Said were his final ones, and they had nothing much to do with him. In 1861, the United States became engulfed in a civil war. A consequence of this was the stoppage of southern cotton from being exported, creating a shortage in the market. Egypt was in an ideal position to take advantage, and cotton exports quickly shot up to supply British factories. The money allowed Said to keep investing in infrastructure and fund his lavish lifestyle. He didn't really go all out on cotton as maybe he should have. The person who did go all out was his successor, Ismail. Depending on who you ask, Ismail is Ismail the Magnificent, Ismail the Great, Or Ismail, that dude who still hasn't paid his debts. Ismail, interest is haram, so I don't believe in it. Or Ismail, let's have a party. Don't worry, my credit card can handle it. He is many things to many people. He accelerated Egypt's modernization program and also weakened it to the point that occupation by the British became inevitable. Coming to power during the cotton boom, he massively invested in the irrigation system, building plenty of canals and further oriented Egypt towards cotton production. He expanded the railway network. He also built 8,000 kilometers of telegraph lines, expanding Egypt's communication network. The number of schools were expanded and Egypt again started sending students to France. The Suez Canal was opened under his watch and the number of Europeans living in Cairo and Alexandria sharply increased, and new developments made these cities more western. Egypt's territories expanded with the annexation of Darfur, and wars against Ethiopia signaled its intentions to expand further. You might look at this and say Ismail is the ideal ruler. What's wrong with all this? Well, a couple of things. For one, a lot of these projects needed money. When you factor in the expensive war with Ethiopia, the bill becomes even larger. Ismail aimed to pay for all this through cotton exports, and if cotton prices stayed high, then no problem. But they didn't. When the civil war ended and US cotton re-entered the market, prices came back down and Egypt suddenly needed a new source of revenue. Egypt started taking on massive amounts of debt. In pretty quick time, Egypt's debt had risen from £3 million to £90 million. For context, Egypt's annual revenue was around £8 million. This sounds concerning, but don't worry, Ismail had a plan. You have the stage now, Ismail.
My name is Jeff.
Okay, he had no plan. When time came for repayment, he borrowed more money at a higher interest rate to kick the can down the road. Very soon, banks stopped lending more money and Egypt's ability to pay back came under question. To raise some quick money, taxes were raised and Egypt sold all its shares in the Suez Canal Company to the British. Despite this, Egypt would declare bankruptcy in 1875. Since most of the money was owed to the British and French, they began increasing their influence in the country. This came in the creation of mixed courts, which gave Europeans a separate legal system to be tried in. The Commission on Public Debt was also formed, which began taking greater control over fiscal policy. Egypt's economy began to suffer from ever-increasing taxes, and Ismail was powerless to stop any of it. He effectively had made himself a puppet. He was removed from power in 1879 after he allowed an anti-European revolt to grow and accepted many of their demands. After putting it down, the British replaced him with Tawfiq Pasha, who is easier to control. The British completed their takeover in 1882 and completed its transformation into a puppet. Thus ended Egypt's chance of becoming a regional power. A modernization program which was intended to secure its independence instead indebted it and allowed it to be taken over. Had its rulers made better decisions, maybe we would be talking about Egypt along with Japan as countries that industrialized and evaded colonization.